You're listening to Trump Deploys Troops to Portland, Authorizing Full Force if Necessary, a news story written by Michael Birnbaum, Todd Frankel, and Dan Lamoth, and read by an AI-generated voice. President Donald Trump said Saturday that he will send troops to Portland, Oregon, and to immigration detention facilities around the country, authorizing full force if necessary, and escalating a campaign to use the U.S. military against Americans that has little modern precedent. Trump said in a social media post that he was directing Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to provide troops to what he dubbed war-ravaged Portland. Portland has been a target of right-wing politicians for the way it has handled racial justice protests as well as its homeless population, tolerating encampments in the central part of the city. But Trump will again encounter the dynamic he did when he deployed the National Guard in Los Angeles, a military deployment in a state run by a Democratic governor who objects to the decision and will have grounds to fight it in court. It was not immediately clear whether Trump plans to deploy active duty troops, National Guard members, or both to Portland. As was the case in similar discussions in other cities, there are legal limits to how he can do so. One official familiar with the discussion on Saturday said defense officials were seeking clarity on what Trump desires in this situation. The official spoke on the condition of anonymity to speak frankly about private planning. Oregon Governor Tina Kotek, Democrat, was one of 19 Democratic governors who signed a letter to Trump last month opposing his deployment of the National Guard over governor's objections. Instead of actually addressing crime, President Trump cut federal funding for law enforcement that states rely on and continues to politicize our military by trying to undermine the executive authority of governors as commanders-in-chief of their state's National Guard, the governor said in the letter. A spokesman for Kotek did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Trump deployed the National Guard to Los Angeles earlier this year over the objection of California Governor Gavin Newsom, Democrat Tao, and more recently deployed them to Washington and Memphis. Critics of Trump's domestic deployments have said they are a needless militarization of a law enforcement activity. They potentially endanger U.S. citizens' lives and politicize the military. The California deployment was contested by Newsom and his team in a lawsuit, and District Court Judge Charles R. Breyer ruled earlier this month that the Trump administration violated the Posse Comitatus Act by placing the troops involved into law enforcement roles. The Trump administration appealed the decision. In a brief order, a 3-judge panel with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit granted the Trump administration's motion to stay the case until its argument could be heard in greater detail. National Guard troops in Washington, whose federalized non-state status gives Trump more leeway to act, have mostly acted in support roles to law enforcement and other federal officers. In June, Trump seized control of the California National Guard over the objections of Newsom, a Democratic political rival, deploying about 4,000 Guard members and a battalion of about 700 active-duty infantry Marines to Los Angeles after protests against immigration and customs enforcement raids turned violent in a few cases. He did so under authorities in Title 10 of federal law, which prohibited the troops from performing any law enforcement mission. Trump also could invoke the Insurrection Act to send active-duty troops to Portland, but such an action is sure to prompt a fierce reaction from political opponents and some military officials and be contested in court. The law allows the president to send military forces if there is an armed rebellion against the U.S., but has rarely been invoked in U.S. history. Trump's announcement followed Attorney General Pam Bondi saying Friday that she ordered Justice Department agents to guard ICE facilities amid continued onslaught of violence, as well as directed counterterrorism task forces to investigate the attacks. Bondi's announcement, made in a social media post with few details about which federal law enforcement agencies would be aiding the effort, came after a shooting at an ICE field office in Dallas. One immigrant detainee was killed and 2 more were injured on Wednesday. Investigators said the gunman wanted to shoot ICE officers, but shot 3 immigrants instead. The Department of Justice will not stand idly by in the face of such lawlessness, Bondi wrote on X. She said she was deploying DOJ agents to ICE facilities to safeguard federal agents and property, and to make arrests. Bondi also said she was ordering the Joint Terrorism Task Forces to disrupt and investigate all entities and individuals engaged in acts of domestic terrorism, including the repeated acts of violence and obstruction against federal agents. Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, responded Friday night to Bondi's post, writing on X, "Assets mobilizing. This campaign of terrorism will be brought down. This is a developing story and will be updated.